Hello students, this is Mr. Emma here with a watercolor technique lesson. We will be going over 12 different types of watercolor techniques for you to use in your own watercolor paintings. But before we get to the techniques, I just want to mention the 5 brushes that we have in front of us. These first two are round brushes, as you can tell by the tip. The round brushes have a larger and a smaller variation. The next 3 brushes that we have here are flat tip brushes. They are very wide as opposed to the more narrow round tips. Okay. So with that in mind, let's move on to the first technique of ours, which is called the wash. So what you want to do, starting any watercolor projects, you want to take the brush. I have a cup of water off screen. I'm going to just dip the brush in there. Try to wipe off any excess water. Then I'm going to take the brush and I'm just going to pick a color. For the sake of this tutorial, it could really be any color, so I'm going to grab this blue right here. Going to get a decent amount on there. Just being nice and gentle with the palette, not being overly forceful or grinding into it. And with this blue, with the giant flat tip brush, I'll be doing the wash technique. I think I added a lot of water there, so I'm gonna try to make the paint a little bit thicker. I'm gonna go back to the palette, try to get more paint on there. There we go, that's a little bit better. So a wash is essentially just a layer of watercolor paint. Okay. Alright, so technique number 2 is called the wet on wet technique. I kind of accidentally did it in the first technique by adding a little bit too much water, but how you secure the wet on wet technique before you add any paint, for the sake of this technique, I'm just using a small, the small round brush. You can kind of use any brush, but the core of this technique is getting your brush wet before any paint and taking the water that's on the brush and applying it to the paper before you even put any paint down. So just putting water, making the area where you're about to paint kind of wet. Okay. And then after we make that wet, then we go and we add some paint onto our brush with a good amount of water as well. The whole point of this technique is to get, yes, kind of a nice washy mark on our paper. You see how it's spread as I applied the paint to the paper? It's spread in that fashion because there was already water applied to it. Alright, for this next technique, I will be using more paint than water, so kind of the exact opposite. As you can see, it's kind of a little bit muddy, I want to say, because there's not too much water, so it almost creates like kind of a mud texture. So let's see what that looks like. Yeah, there we go. It's very viscous. It doesn't have nearly the same movement as the wet on wet or even the wash, because there's proportionally more paint than there is water. So it kind of works like traditional paint with this technique, more so. It resembles like an acrylic paint more than a watercolor. The fourth technique that we have is a more diluted way of painting with watercolor, and you do that by simply adding a little bit more water. It differs from the wet on wet technique. We're not laying down any water on the paper before we apply paint. Instead, we'll just be putting a good amount of water on our brush and just grabbing some paint, but knowing that we have a decent amount of water. Okay. Let's see here. Alright, so up here it looks a little thick, but as you can see towards the bottom here, it's a little bit more diluted. It's kind of thin. That is because all that paint is spreading within a large amount of water. So it's not a dark green as you see in this corner. Most of what I'm brushing on here is a very light color. Our fifth technique has less to do with the amount of water that interacts with the paint, and it more has to do with the shape of the stroke that we will be making with the brush itself. So this will be the small round. This will be an example of the mark you make with a small round brush. Instead of holding it kind of more horizontally, I'm going to hold it more vertically so I get the shape of the tip. As you can see, it's almost like drawing with a pencil or like a marker. This tip is making a really defined trail that I could follow. For the sixth technique, as you can see, I'm holding a different brush now. I'm no longer holding the small round, I'm holding the medium flat brush. And let's see what mark this makes. Alright, we'll pick this kind of brown color here, or tan. Alright, get a good amount of water on there. Okay, let's see here. So as you can see, with the flat tip brush, I can either make these very thick lines, or I could turn the brush and create a more thin line that kind of resembles the round brush. You get a good amount of line variation with the flat brush. For the next technique, this is called the dry brush technique. We'll be going back to the brush that we first used for the wash, our large flat brush. For the dry brush technique, the brush needs to be damp. It can't have no water on it or else no paint will flow. So it's kind of damp, and you want to apply a decent amount of paint to it, but you also want to use, when applying, a good amount of force. As you can see, you're getting a lot of individual streaks. Every little hair on the brush is kind of making its own mark. I began to run out of room on that last sheet of paper, so I just went and grabbed another one. For this next technique, we will not be using a brush at all. Instead, we will grab a paper towel and we will apply that onto the canvas. Maybe add a little bit of water on the paper towel. Just a little bit, not too much. It should be damp. And then we'll put that in the palette. And then with that, need more paint here. And then with that, we get this really interesting texture from the paper towel. It's kind of spotty and splotchy in a way. It's not like smooth like the brush. It's a lot of little splotches that we're creating with the paper towel. For this next technique, we are back to our small round brush, and this is called the blow technique. What essentially we want to do is we want to add a decent amount of water to our brush, get a good amount of paint on it, and apply only at one point on our paper to create a bubble. So create kind of a bubble with our paint, and then we will blow with our mouths. I think I need a lot more water and a lot more paint. Let's see here. Alright. As you can see, in combination with me blowing air out of my mouth, and with gravity, it creates this kind of streak. And it creates a kind of drippy effect that we can see on our paper. This next technique, I'm back to the medium flat tip brush. This technique, I'll be blending two colors together. This technique works well with a lot of water, similar to number 4, the diluted technique. And you want to dilute both colors that you'll be adding so they mix well with each other. You want the water to kind of be the bridge between the two colors. Alright, so let's start with a green right here. Alright, nice and diluted, nice and wet. And let's mix that with blue. Let's try, actually, yeah, let's try blue. Make that nice and diluted there. That example, it's a little bit harder to see because they're both kind of cooler colors on the color wheel. So instead, let's take blue again, apply that so it's nice and wet, rinse off our brush, go quickly to the red over here. There we go. And as you can see, created kind of a dark color there, mixing the red in with the blue. It's kind of lighter on one side, and in the middle it created this kind of darker color. The mixing of two colors technique, after it dries, it becomes a little bit more apparent. When it's wet, it can look as if kind of nothing is happening, but after the water settles and dries into the paper, it becomes more obvious that the two colors have merged. For our next technique, this will be the gradient technique. So if you recall the diluted technique, it will be similar, but instead of the entire instead of it being entirely diluted, we will start off with a thicker wash, and we will just simply add water to it. Continuously just add water. So as you add water, the paint color becomes lighter and lighter. This is the gradient going from the darkest up top to the lightest at the bottom. Our 12th and final technique, I will be using the large flat brush. I find it is easiest to use the large flat brush because it has the largest bristles, which are key to this next technique, which is the splatter technique. For the splatter technique, I want a good amount of water and a good amount of paint. And instead of bringing the brush directly to the paper, we will instead hold the brush with one hand, and with the tip of our finger on the other hand, flick the bristles onto the paper. This creates a very satisfying splattering effect onto the paper. Alright, and these are all the watercolor techniques that you guys will need to use. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.